Simon. So thank you, Simon, for coming to this ISW meeting, and welcome to Wellingborough. I don't know if you've been to Wellingborough before, but if you haven't,
no, it's first time.
It's first time.
Yeah,
and I'm sure you've seen it. It's a wonderful little town.
Good parking.
Good parking.
And free.
Yeah, and free.
And free.
Yeah, Wellingborough does boast about its free parking.
It's a touchy subject, I feel.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Anyway, Simon,
Yeah.
we can perhaps discuss that later. Over to you, Simon, and thank you
Yeah.
very much for coming all the way over from Peterborough.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me. I wrote this talk over the weekend, and as any one who follows the far right in Britain, England, they have a tendency to fall out really quickly. And this morning, Restore Britain imploded over Rupert Lowe and the word ethno-nationalist, so they're not getting on. But I'm going to carry on with what I've written, because I think it's still relevant, and the younger element that's involved in Restore Britain is still very much a part of it, and I'm sure that over the next few days they'll all kiss and make up as the far right does. So my challenge tonight is obviously to make you stay awake and not fall asleep with as it's been hot. So the British far right today is not one party. It's not a movement in the old sense. It's an ecosystem, electoral, street, media, and ideological layers operating simultaneously, each giving the others cover and legitimacy. That framing matters because the conversation about the British far right has been organised around the wrong object for years. We ask whether Farage is dangerous, whether reform is a protest vote or something more serious, whether Tommy Robinson is finished or resurgent. These are questions about individuals and institutions. They miss the structure. And the structure is what this talk is about. The far right in Britain today is more extreme, bigger, and more politically capable than at any point in my 30 years of watching it. That is the view of Hope Not Hate's most recent analysis, and it matches what I've observed on the ground. So tonight I want to map that ecosystem, show how the layers connect, build an argument about what is actually happening that goes beyond personality and party, and towards the question of what produced this, who it serves, and what would stop it. So I'll start with the lineage. There is a history to establish, not because the past repeats neatly, it does not, but because the same political content keeps finding new containers. And you cannot read the current moment without knowing what came before. The National Front said the quiet part loudly. Racial nationalism, street violence, repatriation. No euphemism, no soft language. That crudity was also their ceiling. The politics were too exposed to build beyond a militant core. The British public was not ready to vote openly for what the Front offered. Nick Griffin understood that limitation. The BNP kept the core politics and changed the packaging. Race became culture. Repatriation was repackaged as voluntary return. Supremacy became indigenous rights. Griffin sent members to media training courses. He wanted people who could go on regional television without reaching for the old vocabulary. For a period it worked. Then the BNP cracked, partly from internal dysfunction, partly because it had stretched itself beyond its organisational capacity. The content survived, the container failed. The English Defence League shifted the target. Post 9/11, post 7/7, the available enemy was no longer named in quite the old National Front register. It was Muslims. The EDL could claim, sometimes with what appeared to be genuine conviction, that they were not racists. They opposed an ideology, a religion, a political programme. The BNP sounded like racism. The EDL learned to make racism sound like a defence of liberal civilisation. UKIP and its successors did something different again. Parliamentary populism, the same anxieties about borders, culture, national decline, and elite betrayal were washed through sovereignty language, and Farage's talent for performing as an outsider while being thoroughly embedded in the British media establishment. By the time we arrive at reform, those anxieties are not fringe politics, they are the default register of the right-wing press and much of mainstream broadcast media. And now Restore Britain. Restore is qualitatively different from what came before. It is not simply arguing for lower immigration. Its politics include what its own figures call demographic reversal, mass deportation, remigration in the language of the continental hard right, and the explicit claim that people it describes as native Britain are being replaced. That is great replacement rhetoric, not an approximation of it, the thing itself. And it is being articulated not in badly printed leaflets, but in reports, press releases, parliamentary contributions, media interventions, and a social media operation run by people who know exactly what they are doing. The pattern across all of this is not disappearance and reappearance. It's the same content moving through different forms. Boots become suits, suits become podcasts, podcasts become parliamentary motions, and then right on schedule, the street chants come back. So I've been following and writing about something that I call the ecosystem. So let me map the current structure, because what the far right has assembled in Britain today is more sophisticated than anything this movement has previously managed. There are 4 layers. The first is the electoral layer. Reform is the mass vehicle. What it primarily provides is not just votes, though there's plenty of those. What it provides is normalisation. When Farage frames immigration as civilizational crisis, newspapers do not call it extremism. They call it tapping into real concerns. That is the function reform serves. It moves the terrain of legitimate political speech so that positions that were previously unspeakable begin to sound like common sense. Restore Britain operates differently. This distinction matters. Restore has been reported as claiming more than 96,000 members and now has about 13 councillors, most of them reform defectors, apart from the first Great Yarmouth first councillors who are all new to the party. Whether every membership figure should be taken at face value is a separate question. We don't know how many of those members actually survived the first direct debit mandate, but at the moment, the figure is still around 95, 96,000. It contested its first parliamentary seat in June's Makerfield by-election, and watching that Restore operation on the ground, I think most of the major political parties would have loved the operation that they put in place. They had on one day about 850 canvassers, which is a huge number for a party that has only been going officially since January of this year. It's a disciplined operation. There's an argument about whether they chose the right candidate. If you watch their analysis of the election, they got about 7% of the vote. They are spinning that as a success for a party, as I said, that's very, very new. But I think they expected more. I think they were looking for 13 to 15%. While they would say that they didn't want to split the right-wing vote, I think they would have quite liked to have damaged Reform's chances, but that they imploded for different reasons. So,
do we know those 850 campuses? Do we know anything about where they came?
All over the country. All over the country, they had buses coming up from all different parts of the country. So they've got most of their branches that are obviously very new, and you can't say for any certainty that a branch that has its first meeting and has 40, 50 people photographed, whether that same 40 or 50 people will turn up for the next meeting. But that is the picture that their social media is presenting to its membership, that each meeting is a success.
There was a meeting in June in Rushden, and I've got photographs of it with about 40, 50 people at it in Rushden.
Yeah,
It's
I know where they're
frightening,
from.
that.
They'll meet at the Windmill Club in
Mhm.
Rushden.
It's frightening.
So the literature was professional. The activists knew their lines. They were not trying to win the seat. They were trying to build a political identity. I think they knew that they were not going to beat Burnham, and they knew that they were probably not going to get more votes than the Reform candidate. So Restore is not trying to replace Reform overnight. It's trying to discipline Reform from the right. And the implosion this morning, some of the influencers that have been close to Restore are saying that they've actually succeeded in pushing Farage and Zia Youssef into a harder line. So it wants to pull the whole discussion further towards deportation, demographic reversal, and what its figures call national restoration. And if you are ever bored and you want to read their policy papers, you know, we're talking 100, 150 page policy proposals on everything from their deportation policy to what they call the Castle Doctrine, which will give you the right to shoot people that come into your house, to saving the high street, and their energy policy should come as no surprises that oil and gas is kind of back on the table along with nuclear. So there's a political logic to this that should not be underestimated. The second layer is the street. Tommy Robinson still matters, though less as an innovator than as a conversion mechanism. He takes diffuse resentment and turns it into crowd feeling, into collective experience, into the particular kind of political identity that forms when people stand together and feel they have been silenced together. At Robinson's May rally, people near the stage chanted "Rupert, Rupert," meaning Rupert Lowe, Restore Britain's parliamentary leader. Restore Britain emblems were visible in the crowd. The street and the ballot paper are no longer separate worlds. They are learning to recognise each other. The third layer is media and platforms. This is where the speed comes from. GB News, Telegraph columns, X accounts, outrage clips, influencer commentary, pseudo-documentaries, just asking questions, posts cycling through the algorithm. The far right has understood something about contemporary media that the left has been slower to grasp. A claim does not need to be true. It just needs to circulate long enough to become atmosphere. Once it is atmosphere, it stops being a claim. It becomes common sense. The thing everyone already knows. The truth that power is supposedly suppressing. The fourth layer is ideology. This is where the heaviest words sit. Remigration, demographic transformation, native minority, civilizational survival, our people. These words provide the framework that makes the rest of the ecosystem legible to those inside it, and increasingly to people who would not describe themselves as far right at all. There is a figure worth knowing here. Harrison Pitt, Restore Britain's senior policy fellow, hosted a live event in Vienna earlier this year, organised by the European Conservative and the publisher Vauban Books, in which he moderated a conversation between Renaud Camus, the man who coined the term Great Replacement, and Martin Sellner, the Australian identitarian who has been banned from entering Britain. And I think Camus is also banned from entering Britain. So Pitt was not a guest at someone else's event, he was running it, and he is Restore Britain's senior policy fellow. He writes most of their policies. Documented fact, not inference. The ideology is transnational. The British operation is embedded in a European network, working from a common political programme. The most dangerous words are often the cleanest ones. So I've got a not a unique theory, but a theory that I or a framework that I use when I'm analysing things, and it's called the long 1980s. So before I explain how the mechanisms work, I need to establish the material condition that makes them possible, because the far right does not grow in a vacuum. It grows in specific soil. And to understand the soil, you have to go back to 1979. Not to Thatcher specifically, though she matters, to what 1979 represents. A rupture in the terms on which British politics operated. A settlement, and the central claim of my analysis is the settlement made in 1979 has never been broken. This is what I mean by the long 1980s. The 1980s never ended. The conditions created in that decade persist, have deepened, and have not been fundamentally reversed by any government since. Understanding that is the key to understanding why the far right is where it is today. What was the settlement? Deindustrialization, which sounds like an economic process, but was a political choice. The deliberate destruction of British manufacturing, particularly in the North, the Midlands, Wales, and Scotland. Towns built around specific industries with identities and cultures rooted in specific forms of collective work were stripped of their economic foundations. In Peterborough, where I grew up and where I began this work in the 90s, you see it in real time. The brickworks, the engineering shops, the precision tool manufacturers that had employed people's fathers and grandfathers, gone over the course of a decade and nothing coming back to replace them. The defeat of organised labour, the miners' strike of 84 to 85, is the decisive confrontation, but it is the culmination of a longer process. Anti-union legislation, the systematic dismantling of collective bargaining, the deliberate suppression of the only institutional counterpower working people had built over a century. Privatisation, dressed as an efficiency argument, but functionally the removal of democratic accountability over essential services. Water, energy, transport, telecoms, all moved out of the scope of political decision-making and into the scope of shareholder return. And housing, right to buy was presented as liberation. What it actually did was remove social housing stock without replacement and began the long process of treating housing as an investment asset rather than a social good. The foundation of the crisis people are living today was laid then. That is the settlement. And here is the crucial point. Blair did not break it. This needs saying directly because there is a persistent myth that New Labour represented a break, or at least a pause. It did not. Blair and Brown accepted the Thatcher settlement on every structural question that mattered. They accepted the anti-union legislation. They extended privatisation through PFI. They marketised public services further and called it modernisation. They celebrated financial deregulation right up until the system collapsed in 2008. They redistributed some of the proceeds of the boom to people at the bottom, and that matters, but they did not touch the structure. Cameron deepened it. Austerity after 2010 was not an emergency measure, it was an ideological project. The further dismantling of the state under the cover of fiscal crisis. And Starmer has confirmed it. The long 1980s continues. Why does this matter for understanding the far right? Because the communities the far right now target are precisely the communities the settlement destroyed. The anger in those places is real, and it is decades old. People were told across these decades that the market knew best, that manufacturing was the past, that globalization was progress, that being left behind was a condition to be managed, not a verdict to be contested. And when they were still left behind 30 years later, they were told to be more aspirational, more flexible, more mobile. The far right arrived in those communities and said, "You were betrayed." And it was right about that. The betrayal happened. It named the wrong betrayer. That is where the politics of the long 1980s meets the politics of the far right. The fuel is real grievance. The engine is misdirection. The people who lit the fire are not the ones being blamed for it. So how does this politics work in practice? Condemnation is not enough here. You have to understand the mechanisms. Real pain, false address. People are angry because housing is unaffordable. Wages have eroded across 15 plus years. The NHS is in visible crisis. Local government has been systematically gutted, and work is more insecure than it was for the generation before. The anger is legitimate. The target has been given is not. The far right says the migrant did it, the asylum seeker in the hotel did it, foreign cultures did it. Real pain, false address. I want to dwell on this because the usual liberal response to far right growth is bewilderment. Why do people believe this? They believe it partly because the pain is real. The explanation is simple and the figure of the enemy is emotionally legible in a way that structural analysis rarely is. The left often has the correct account of what produced the pain. The problem is that structural analysis does not produce the same feeling as an enemy. In a period of fear, blame travels faster than explanation. What makes the politics sustainable is a practice I would call evidence laundering. Restore probably calls it research infrastructure. They produce reports, inquiries, comparison tools, data threads, crowd-funded parliamentary inquiries. The Rupert Lowe-chaired rape gang report is the clearest recent example. Non-statutory, crowdfunding, no legal powers, no obligation to follow the rules of evidence, but it has a format. Witnesses were called, findings were published. The format does the laundering. Once something looks like a report, the claims inside it had moved halfway into respectability before anyone checks the methodology. The grooming gang material requires care because it is frequently mishandled on the left. The abuse was real. The institutional failures were catastrophic. Children were failed repeatedly and over years by agencies that knew something was wrong and looked away. That is historical record. It's important to say it plainly. The question is what the far right does with it. What it does is construct a chain. Abuser to Muslim man, to Islam, to Pakistani culture, to mass immigration, to the argument for demographic reversal. Justice for survivors would mean prosecuting every perpetrator and fundamentally reforming the institutions that failed them. That is not what the far right wants. It wants victims turned into racial ammunition. There is another mechanism, harder to see because it depends on distribution rather than any single statement. No individual actor carries the full program at once. One figure says demographic change, another says mass deportation is the only serious response, a third says our children are not safe, a fourth posts the street footage, a fifth asks why the mainstream media is suppressing the story, a sixth writes the op-ed asking whether ordinary people have been abandoned by the establishment. Each part can deny the whole. The whole keeps moving. Stuart Hall called this a relay, ideas and effects passing through a chain of actors, each of whom can claim partial distance from the most extreme version, while the cumulative effect is the normalization of that extreme. You do not need the theory to see the practice. Watch the Restore Britain social media ecosystem for a week and the relay becomes visible. What changes between the tiers is not the content, it is the register. And what is troubling about this structure beyond the immediate politics is that it makes accountability almost impossible to assign. You cannot prosecute a relay. Individual incitement laws can catch a node, they cannot catch the network. That is why the response cannot be primarily legal. It has to be political. It has to map the relay, expose the handoffs, and show how the respectable and the extreme keep each other alive. Acknowledging, of course, that this is considerably easier to say than to build. Alongside this runs what I call the respectability loop. Online accounts say it crudely, influencers make it viral, politicians say it carefully, newspapers ask whether ordinary people have a point, the BBC invites the far right figure to respond, the far right figure claims to have been silenced, the claim of silencing generates more content, the figure returns to the studio. There is no need for conspiracy here. The incentives of outrage-driven media and the tactics of the modern far right are structurally compatible. The loop does not need to be planned, it runs on its own. It's not too much more, so I hope. The long 1980s explains the soil. The question of why the far right is growing in this specific moment requires one more layer. 2008 was the inflection point that should have broken the settlement. The financial crisis exposed as fiction the argument that markets know best and deregulation produces prosperity. The banks were rescued at enormous public cost. The losses were socialised, the gains remained private. Then the governments looked at the bill and handed it to the people who had done least to run it up. That is what austerity was, the political management of a crisis the settlement had produced, managed in the interests of those who had caused it. The anger that followed was real and legitimate. It arrived at precisely the moment new communication technologies gave that anger somewhere to go. Platforms rewarding outrage over accuracy, algorithms amplifying the most provocative version of any claim, a media ecosystem in which a false story could circle the world before the correction had loaded. The far right understood this infrastructure earlier and more completely than the left did. It built specifically for it. Into that space, Labour offers management without transformation. The structural grievance stays unaddressed. The space stays open. The far right keeps moving into it. The downstream consequences are not abstract. Police Scotland charged a man over the weekend after 5 people were attacked in Edinburgh in incidents that are being investigated as potential anti-Muslim hate crimes, with counter-terrorism officers involved. Tell Mama has documented year-on-year rises in anti-Muslim hate incidents, with increasing aggression in the cases reported. This is not random. It is what happens when hatred is laundered as a concern, when a major politician can describe Muslim communities as a civilizational threat and be invited back to the studio the following week. So what anti-fascists should do. I want to be practical here, not inspirational. Inspiration is cheap. First, stop fighting yesterday's far right. This movement does not live only in boots, flags, poorly printed leaflets, and 40-person marches through town centres. It lives in Substack newsletters, X threads, TikTok videos, local Facebook groups, and respectable-looking events in hotel function rooms, council chamber questions, and crowd-funded inquiries with parliamentary cover. Restore Britain has built local electoral infrastructure, including vehicles like Great Yarmouth First, designed to operate at community level before anyone was paying attention. Anti-fascist practice has to operate at the same speed in the same spaces. Otherwise, it will always be responded to something that has already moved on. Second, map the relay. Not the ideology in the abstract, but the specific network. Who posts, who amplifies, who sanitizes the content, who provides institutional cover, who enters Parliament carrying it, who funds the events, books the venues, sits on the boards. The network is visible if you watch it systematically. Publishing that map is different from publishing a denunciation. A denunciation can be dismissed as political motivation. A documented network is harder to wave away. Third, answer the material crisis. This is where anti-fascism work has to go further than most of it has been willing to. Naming the scapegoat is necessary. It is not sufficient. Someone who believes the refugee hotel is a source of their housing crisis needs to encounter an analysis that explains how the housing crisis was actually produced, not a lecture, an argument with evidence and anger attached to it. Your rent is unaffordable because land has been treated as an investment asset for 40 years. Your town is hollowed out because capital left and the state was told to follow it. Your NHS is understaffed because it was marketised and chronically underfunded by governments of both parties. The enemy is not the person who arrived last year with nothing. The enemy is the system that needs you angry at the person who arrived last year with nothing. Fourth, refuse the framing on communities under attack. Do not say most Muslims are good people or most migrants contribute to the economy. Both sentences accept the premise that these communities are on trial and some members might be acquitted. Reject the premise. Muslims are not guests in this country on conditional license. Migrants are not an administrative problem awaiting processing. Black and brown Britons are not provisional citizens whose legitimacy depends on how well they perform integration for a hostile press. Finally, build before the crisis arrives. The far right does best where the state has withdrawn and no other institution has filled the gap. Tenants' unions, workplace organisation, community defence, political education, trade unions, local media monitoring. This is the infrastructure that has to exist before the lie arrives in the town, not after it. I want to acknowledge that this is easier to say than to organise. The institutions the left built in the post-war decades, trade unions with real power, labour councils with real resources, cooperative structures, community centres, were systematically dismantled. What exists in their place is thinner and more precarious. Anti-fascist organisation is operating in the same degraded terrain as everything else. That does not make it less necessary. Pretending otherwise helps nobody. You do not defeat this movement by fact-checking it at midnight. You defeat it by being the institution people should have had before the lie was needed. So, to close, the danger in Britain today is not a sudden surge of cleverness on the hard right. It is a specific convergence, decades of manufactured decline, a political centre that has made its peace with that decline, media systems that run on outrage, platforms that accelerate hatred for profit, and a movement that has learned better than any previous generation to operate simultaneously across the respectable and the extreme. 1 foot in the parliamentary chamber, 1 foot on the street. A language of restoration wrapped around a politics of racial threat. Farage is not the end point. Reform is not the outer edge. Restore Britain shows where the pressure is coming from. Harder, younger, more ideologically coherent, more networked, and more willing to say openly what the previous generation of the British far right had learned to conceal. The answer to this is not panic. Panic names nothing and organises nothing. The answer is clarity about what the far right is, who it serves, how it moves, and what has to be built to stop it. The question is not whether Britain can be restored. The question is who broke it, who profited from the break-in, and why the people responsible are so desperate for us to blame our neighbours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm just thinking it's now 8 minutes past 8. Do you want to take a 5-minute break for people to get drinks and stuff, and then we'll come back and have the discussion? What do people think? Or have a bit of a discussion now? Quick break then. Okay. Saw some nods.